Welcome back to the channel. Some years ago, almost 10 years ago, I hosted a podcast called SCIFI on Screen. The podcast lasted about 5+ years, and I gently closed it down in order to transition into a YouTube channel talking more about books and movies. But I reviewed films one at a time, sometimes compared originals to remakes, sometimes I did special shows. But a lot of the criticisms and a lot of the critiques and analysis that I did for these films, I stand by. And so I thought, since I've done over about 100 shows, that I would share the archives with my new audience here on my YouTube channel. The shows range from about 45 minutes or so more of a podcast. I'll just put up a static image of the old logo, and you can listen and enjoy. I'm going to do these weekly, and hope you enjoy. Welcome to another episode of Sci-Fi on Screen. I'm your host, Jeff Palermo, and this week I'm going to be taking a look at the original and remake of Total Recall. So I'll be going through both films side by side, trying to compare them as we go through each section of the film. I'm going to start out with some background on the original film. Total Recall was released in 1990. Both of these films are derivative of a Philip K. Dick short story called We Can Remember It For You Wholesale. Dick published it initially in 1966 in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. In the late 80s, screenwriter Dan O'Bannon and Ronald Shusett of Alien fame took a crack at writing a draft. At that point, Dino De Laurentiis was going to produce the thing, and he was eyeing Richard Dreyfuss and or Patrick Swayze to star. It never came to pass. Next to pick up the property was David Cronenberg, who was eyeing William Hurt in the title role. And I believe the Cronenberg pass introduced the mutants to the script. So I think it's gathering moss in a sense as it's being hustled along. And then eventually came to Carolco Films. Arnold Schwarzenegger was related with Carolco via Terminator franchise, and so he convinced them to buy the rights to it. He got some incredible deal where he had ridiculous control over everything, veto power over the director or the producers. So they got Paul Verhoeven to direct, and he had done RoboCop in 1987, so he was fresh off like a pretty big hit. And he actually considered Arnold for the title role in that film, so it feels like those guys were circling each other. They did a script rewrite. A guy named Gary Goldman did a rewrite. Supposedly, Hollywood legend is that this thing has gone through 42 drafts, and I'm sure it's not a high number in terms of most big-budget films, Jerry Goldsmith was on board to do the score. And the background on the remake, not much really. I guess the script was commissioned and was written by a guy named Kurt Wimmer. Kurt Wimmer was responsible for bringing Equilibrium to the screen. I believe he wrote it. Primarily a writer. He wrote the Sphere adaptation. He wrote and directed Equilibrium. He wrote and directed Ultraviolet, Law Abiding Citizen, Salt. So he's, Wimmer, I guess, is kind of a player. And a year after, he delivered his script, they got Len Wiseman on board. I checked out a brief interview with Wiseman, and he was saying that, he liked the fact that it diverged from the original, and it really kind of drew him in. Len Wiseman is the creator of the Underworld franchise. So I believe he wrote and directed and created the first two, and then the other ones were made sort of without him. He may have produced. Also directed I think Live Free or Die Hard. Not the latest Die Hard, but the one before that. With that, let's talk about the first portions of both films. We'll start with the 1990 film. So the 1990 film opens with a credit sequence and Jerry Goldsmith's wonderful opening theme, which is very cool. Actually, I really like the score to Total Recall a lot. Very horns heavy. To me, it kind of opens up the film from time and time again. I hear that the real horn heavy score, and it kind of, it gives it a little bit of an epic feel. So we open on blood red saturated Mars landscape. We see two spacesuited figures looking out over this wonderful cliff. It's Arnold and Rachel Tickerton, and we're not told any names of yet. So basically Doug Quaid and Melina. They're holding hands, and Arnold loses his footing and falls and smashes his faceplate of his helmet. And we have the beginnings of this gruesome
physical decompression scene where the Martian atmosphere, is incredibly hostile and there's no air, and I believe the pressure's lower. So as we're seeing Arnold, it cuts and morphs into a sort of a visual effects animatronic Arnold head. And its eyeballs are growing really wide, and his tongue's coming out, and it's leading up to, we don't cut away, we're going to basically see his head explode, and then we cut away. He wakes up in his apartment in a dream. He's lying next to Laurie, his girlfriend, played by Sharon Stone. They talk about the fact that he has these dreams fairly regularly. She's jealous of the girl in the dream that he's told her about, and so they have this little back and forth where they're playing around, and she opens up her bodice to distract him from everything, and they get busy, as it were. So we cut to Arnold sort of getting ready for work, making himself a nice protein shake, and he's watching the news on the wall screen, and we're getting the information about terrorists on Mars, and that there's mining on Mars. There's a substance called turbinium ore. We get some combat footage on television while he's making his shake. We're dropped a whole bunch of information. We hear the name Quado. We hear Freedom Brigade. We hear something about pyramid mines that the rebels want reopened. And we get a little bit of Verhoeven's black humor, which is so on display in RoboCop, which I will cover in a future podcast, where you hear the announcer say, minimal use of force was used to, quell the rebels. And on screen, the cops basically are gunning down like dozens of rebels, and they're bleeding out like right on camera. It's very funny, only as Verhoeven can be funny. And then we see briefly Vilos Cohagen, played by Ronnie Cox. Picture of him, we're told that he's the administrator of the Martian colony. So Laurie comes in, flips the news off, and we get this wonderful wall screen, like all this huge 3-panel screen where it's sort of a mountain lake vista. It's really cool, actually. I mean, it's still effective, I think, now. It's still like, boy, I'd love to have some of it in my apartment. So the byplay between the two of them is Doug is sort of like, let's do it, Laurie, let's move to Mars. And she's not into it at all. And she sits on his lap again, trying to distract him, and he flips back to Cohagen. And we hear more information about how the demining of this substance called turbinium is fueling the Northern Bloc war effort. So we get a sense that Earth is at war. And we hear about some alien artifacts. That is it a rumor? Is it news? So we hear Arnold, he's yearning for a more significant life. He feels like there's something more to him than just being a construction worker. And she kind of bats it back and forth to the point where he drops it. So the next sequence is Doug on his way to work, and we get the exterior of this world. It's a lot of cement. It's very sort of Studio City, or Century City, I should say, future. A lot of cement, stone blocks, and metal walkways. It's very kind of 80s futuristic in a weird way. It's also very oppressive and drab, as I think Verhoeven wanted to get at. And we get our first true blue special effect, in that before he gets on the subway to go to work, he has to walk through a large mural-size X-ray machine. And as he walks through, Schwarzenegger disappears, and we see emerging across the screen a skeleton outlined in green. It's a very cool effect. I still think it works now. I mean, just seeing the film recently, it's done well enough so that it still has a great impact. Once he leaves and walks on, they linger on the sort of the exit way, and we see the skeletons of people and animals go across the screen. All of a sudden, the people emerge, and it's very seamless. Like, it's very impressive how well they do it. Still, to this day, I think it's really cool. Next shot is he's on a very crowded subway that's very full of TV screens, which, have not made it to our present yet. The subway is still, TV free, thank God. But he sees an ad for Recall. So the technology here is that, people are poor, right? I guess most of the world is poor. Money being fueled into the war effort. There's a lot of war going on. And then the Recall will be able to implant memories of any fantasy you want, a vacation, whatever it is you want to travel. It's kind of marketed more as like a travel thing. It's like when you go Recall, you always get the best. And, so the memories are implanted. And when you leave Recall, you have the actual memories of doing whatever it is that you wish to do, and you design the trip to meet whatever needs you want. So, very cool. And of course, the hinge on which this whole movie functions. So we get to the job site. We see Arnie, with a jackhammer in a rock pit, drilling with his bare arms, and just what a monster body. All right. I mean, he was young and in his ridiculous prime, and my God, he is a massive figure. And and very charismatic on a purely physical way. Pretty amazing. And we get his buddy Harry, and he asks Harry about recall, and Harry warns him that some guy got lobotomized. Don't mess with your brain, pal. And as Doug continues to work, we see Harry kind of give him these lingering looks as if something else is going on. We're not sure what. Now I'm going to flip over to the remake, and I'm going to run through the remake up till kind of the similar. They run very parallel, so it'll be pretty easy to compare the two films as we go. This film, we don't get a credit sequence. We get straight up Total Recall, and then they go into title card sequence, and we see this sort of translucent globe on the screen. And I'll read the title card info. It's, quote, "At the end of the 21st century, global chemical warfare left the planet nearly uninhabitable. Living space is now Earth's most valuable resource. Only two territories remain, the United Federation of Britain, which on the globe is shown as Britain and some of continental Europe as well, and the colony, basically shown to us on the globe as Australia. Workers from the colony travel through the planet each day on the only transport possible, the fall." So the setup we're getting here is that the whole world is pretty much uninhabitable except for Great Britain and Australia. So we open in a very intense scene. And we open with Doug Quaid and Melina, this time played by Colin Farrell and Jessica Biel. The lights are flashing in some medical chamber. There's some dead bodies laying there. Very slick modern filmmaking here. Lots of lens flares. They're in a medical chamber, and there are some police and what looks like robots outside a locked door trying to get in. And there's already some slow-mo going on here, like, Wiseman's packing it all in early. And so at some point, we get the sense that the two of them are trapped, so they open up this window or this area that leads down to some place where they can both escape. So they do an "I love you" to each other, and they kiss, and she says it back. They're escaping down a drop of some kind, and Quaid is caught by some weird stun net. So one of the weapons in this new film, which it's kind of odd, is that a gun shoots out these ropes that light up. Once they become around you, there's some attractive force that the gun that shot them exerts. And so you're pulled back towards the gun, or the gun can move you around. So you're pretty much snared. They're both holding hands. She's halfway out the window, and she's like, "I'm not going to come without you," and he's like, "I'll find you," and let's go. She drops. Then he wakes up. So we have a similar dream sequence. It's been a dream. We see Laurie, this time played by Kate Beckinsale, waking behind him. Now, this time, he lies about there being another woman in the dream. Then they have a quasi-realistic discussion. She's like, "Is this a dream or metaphor for our marriage? So what's this about, honey? Are you trapped and you're trying to get out? Do I trap you? Whatever." And it's kind of cool. And then we hear of a bombing in the UFB. And all of a sudden, she's got to go. So she has some job, I guess, that's connected to the government. We don't really know. The weird thing about this is when the call comes and she has to go, she feels like the more significant character. And I'm going to talk about this as we go on. There's a very odd weight given to Kate Beckinsale in Total Recall. And she and the director, Len Wiseman, are husband and wife. I'm only going to say that once. But she's given an unduly amount of weight in the scenes. To me, it unbalances the movie and makes it a very odd experience in a lot of ways. And this is the first time I feel that. We're more on her. In a sense, during this scene, I want to follow her out the door. And I don't really give a shit about him. So very weird. So then she leaves, and now Doug is alone having breakfast, and he's watching the news of the terrorist bombing, and we get the world situation. Quato is now Matthias, played by a guy named Bill Nighy. There's a resistance movement. Cohagen is now the Chancellor of the United Federation of Britain, played by Bryan Cranston. And we're given a photograph of Ethan Hawke, who is announced as a agent named Carl Hauser. So a lot of, the names are very similar. All the players are kind of in their right spots. And Hauser is attributed to a former bombing of the UFB. Then Quaid walks to his balcony, and we get a sci-fi world. Camera swings around. I think we're in the colony at this point. I think Doug lives in the colony. It's confusing at times where his apartment is. And it's kind of a generic post-Blade Runner type of futuristic thing. It's everything in this movie is seamless and, beautiful, but it's also very generic. And so you're looking out, what hits me is that, I've seen all this before. Then we cut to a night scene, and it's very Blade Runner. The production design of the colony in this film is really, really a Blade Runner rip, big time. Nicely done, very beautifully rendered, for sure. But at the same time, it's kind of a mashup in a way that's not, to me, it didn't really jump out at me. So he's walking and he sees a blimp overhead and a voice, and that's where we get the recall advertisement. And the blimp is right at a Blade Runner as well. It's a complete tech check, as it were, from the Ridley's Blade Runner. So we get the recall advertisement, and he comes to understand. And the technology in the two films is pretty much the same. There's not much difference in the cool idea of recall and what it does. He's on his way to work, and he goes through a scanning area as well, and not nearly as cool as Verhoeven's. It's a whole different, like a stand-up single scanner. It's neat, very well rendered, slick, beautiful looking, but not nearly as striking as what Verhoeven cooked up in the original. And we see a rebel tagging a wall, in the name of the rebellion, and he's arrested. And then we meet the version of Harry in this film. It's Quaid's buddy, I believe the name is still Harry, played by an actor named Bokeem Woodbine. He and Harry get on the fall transportation device because even though they live in the colony, they work the UFB, as it were. There's this conversation between the two. Again, they're sticking with the character of Quaid being dissatisfied with his life. And Harry, in this one, is sort of chiding him, and they do it visually here where they're sitting in the same seats every day. And so Harry gets up and sits in different seats, and there's a little joke about it. Kind of clever. And again, Bokeem Woodbine is a very charismatic actor. And when he comes on the scene, again, I feel like he overshadows Colin Farrell to a degree. He seems to be a more interesting actor with more interesting potential about him. It's very odd. Again, it makes for Quaid, and maybe that was the intent, to make Quaid just everyman, and he's a great spy because he just blends in and he has an everyman face. But it's very odd as a viewing experience. Then during the trip, there are news screens in the fall vessel. They're watching the news, and Cohagen now announces that he's cutting colony aid due to this latest terrorist bombing. We see Quaid reading an old copy of an Ian Fleming James Bond novel to give us a little foreshadowing of his character. This fall thing is kind of cool. It goes through the core of the Earth, and there's a gravity reversal. Once it passes the core, it doesn't go directly through the core. When they show the CGI effects, it's almost like when you're in an airliner, right, and there's that visual that comes up of where you are on your trip. There's a similar thing here. It shows that, it sort of goes around the core, but pretty much through most of the planet. It's kind of bizarre, like they have this kind of technology. And, to me, it's sort of like anti-gravity. Like sometimes when you see films that use what is truly transcendent technology, but the rest of the world is just kind of mundane. And that's kind of feel about this. Like the fall is pretty crazy. And the rest of the world is kind of slightly more futuristic than ours. So kind of odd. When they get to the UFB, though, we get a really good look at this synthetic police, and they're beautifully rendered, They kind of reminded me of the iRobot design. Very slick, very commercial. And there's some vodka print ad campaign that as a woman, I think she's like a female cyborg or some kind. Just, again, very slick. So they're very cool looking, but again, not striking looking and not in any way interesting to my eye anyway. It's just very slick. Everything's very slick. They're in the locker room suiting up for their jobs, and we get the same scene where Quaid asks Harry about recall, and the same response from Harry: "Don't fuck with your brain, pal. A buddy of mine got lobotomized," so on and so forth. So the job here, Quaid works in a plant that manufactures the synthetic police force that we're starting to see more and more of. And we see him, a new recruit, sort of working on a pair of them, and he knows these things inside and out now because that's his job, and which will come into play later in the film, which I think is pretty clever because whatever Quaid does in the original film doesn't really matter later on. But what Quaid does in this film actually comes into play later on. So I think that's a pretty cool improvement on the first one. So the new guy has been to recall. He tells him the lobotomy stuff is all urban legend and it's like the best thing he's ever done. And he gives Quaid a card to go. And then we've got this other scene that's inserted in here where Quaid's called into HR. Because of the bombing, I guess he's being asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement with all the technology that they're using. And Quaid, of course, bristles. So there's this whole back and forth. They're really trying to do like a 9/11 kind of thing here. It's okay, like the scene's not terrible, but I don't know that it really needed to be there because to me it didn't really add much. It was very much on the nose. It was a very much on the nose commentary, as it were. So then we cut back to the fall again, and he's on the commute home, and he has the same dream that we saw in the opening of the film as he's dozing off on the ship. So he gets home, Laurie's in bed already, and Doug goes out with Harry for beers. They're at this bar, and he tells Harry about his dreams, and he's talking about the dreams make him feel like, that he's meant for something and that he's important, and him and Harry talk about their working class lives, and Harry's like, dude, we're living the dream, and it's kind of laughing, but you get the sense that Harry's accepted his life. He's playing the part of Doug's buddy where, like, dude, what else do you want, man? We have it all, The last little piece of this before he gets to recall, so he heads into the seedier part of the colony. And again, we're in Blade Runner design territory here, big time. It's nighttime, and there's light up umbrellas and synthetic prostitutes, which are kind of cool looking. And there's a cool thing here where we see a person getting a glowing tattoo. So in a sense, someone's getting their back tattooed with a substance that glows like neon. It's really neat, actually, really beautiful looking. And then out of nowhere, we get a prostitute who bears her chest to Quaid, and she's got 3 breasts. Now, this makes absolutely no sense. There's no mutant angle in the remake. The mutant angle is in the original film, and when you see a woman with 3 breasts, you've already seen various other types of mutants, and you've heard tell about their mutation does strange things to them. And actually, Quato is a mutant, and there are all different types of mutants that have different kind of weird, strange powers, as it were. This one is just a complete, I could just imagine some executive, poring over the script and saying, where's the chick with the 3 tits? Why isn't she in here? And Len Wiseman grinding his teeth into his cheeks saying, sir, we'll put her in right away, and it's just stupid. And it really felt like an insulting thing in this film. Because this film is not done tongue in cheek. It's done very modern, very earnestly, very grimly. And then to have this thing, it's just tonally wrong, and it's just... I'll stop here. So we have the 2 films that have opened. First, I want to talk about Arnold versus Colin Farrell. In the original, right, we have Arnold. This is when Arnold was fairly young. He had just, he'd only done like The Terminator and some of his early movies. And his accent was really still very bad. He can't act. The man cannot act verbally, like when he talks with his horrible accent. Like, it's really bad, right? But there's something about Arnold, about how he's like Tom Cruise in this way, in that he throws himself into the role physically in a very strong way. And the way he is up there, like, he's not smug. I don't think he's trying to get over on anybody. Like, he's like very earnestly performing. It just rolls off him. I think this is one of the secrets to his charm, is that, he's in films where physically he's great. And, when he uses his body, when he's running, when he's in action scenes, like, I can tell he's very careful and very precise about what he's doing in any scene. Like, I never see Arnold really just kind of mailing it in any action scene. Whatever moves he makes. And I have to believe that, like, if directors haven't directed him well enough, that he comes up with his own choreography, in a sense. Because he always looks very good at what he's doing. The way punches land, the way kicks are given. It's terrific. He has a screen charisma. There's no denying it. And it's so powerful that it overshadows his terrible accent and his inability to really act. But he's amazingly watchable. And now Farrell, on the other hand, I like Colin Farrell as an actor, but I've liked him in small character-driven films. In a sense, he does interior life really well as a real actor to me. I've never really found Colin Farrell sitting atop an action movie or a big movie where I thought it worked. Alexander being one. And what happens in this movie with the remake with Colin Farrell is, I think, what happened to Kingdom of Heaven with Orlando Bloom. They're fine actors, but like they don't have the physical presence to hold a big movie down. And it's a real lesson here when you compare these 2 films about a physical presence on screen, and not necessarily big, right? Because not everybody who's muscle bound has a presence. Just think about Heath Ledger in the Batman films. Like, my God, that man held the screen, and he was like a waif. So it's not so much physical size. It happens to be Arnold's conviction and physical size in this movie, but Colin Farrell just does not, to me. I'm bored with him as a leading man, and there's nothing much going on. And he's handicapped as well because there's no character. I mean, Doug Quaid, in a sense, is an empty character. So unless you have a natural movie star gravitas you're bringing to the screen, there's no role here. What's the poor guy going to do except look baffled and, on the run for his life? So, yeah, and again, what I mentioned, it doesn't really happen too much yet. It will happen more, is that Farrell is overshadowed more and more by all the other players in this film, by Cranston, by Bokeem Woodbine, by certainly, I think this was director's choice, by Kate Beckinsale. In terms of the first part, at this point, I don't know that any movie is better than any other. The three-breasted girl, not my favorite, but in terms of introducing the characters, I definitely feel a sense of Arnold centering the film in the first movie. Feels very comfortable. The second movie, I feel more of a sci-fi vibe, like definitely, because of the fall. We've introduced this whole technology and this setup where everything's on Earth, whereas in the first one, we've got the Martian thing, but they haven't left Earth yet, so we haven't been introduced to it yet. Okay, so now we head back to the original version. Doug Quaid, played by Arnold, arrives at Recall. We got another sci-fi touch, a little bit of tech here. The receptionist is doing her nails, but she's got these instant digital nails. So she touches a little device to her nails, and it instantly changes color. So she keeps changing the color here and there as we watch, and it's definitely very cool. So Quaid enters. We see the secretary using a video phone, another of the new sci-fi touches. A guy by the name of McClure describes to Doug the 2-week package to Mars and so on and so forth. And then he kind of sells him the what he calls the ego trip. Why can't, would it be nice to take a vacation from yourself? And of course, Doug sees Secret Agent and his eyes light up. And Arnold looks like a big kid as he's sitting there. So Arnold sits in the chair, and there's a woman interviewing him about his tastes in women. And so, Arnold goes through the whole deal. And at the end of it, we see actually a picture of Melina, which, again, is part of the ambiguity of this film, ultimately. How would there be a picture of Melina in this machine? And also, there's a matte painting in the background. There's alien artifacts are part of the Mars package. And of course, they're saying that we're trying to keep up with the news, but what we see there is almost exactly what he discovers when he gets there. So again, little ambiguity in terms of the end of the film. Like, did he really have this experience? Or was it just, in fact, a recall trip? We also get a little bit of a tip here. One of the guys who's grabbing sort of the module that they're going to, send him on, we hear kind of a throwaway line in the background. Oh, that's a new one. Blue sky on Mars. And again, that's what happens at the end of this movie is the atmosphere generator. It is blue sky on Mars. So a lot of little ambiguous throwaway lines in this sequence. So we fade into the machine, and then, from here on, it's anyone's guess as to the reality of the thing. It's a great sequence where McClure is selling another patient a package, and we see via the video phone a bunch of people screaming at him. He won't pick up the phone, and someone has to actually bust in and tell him the Quaid is flipping out, and we go in there, and Arnold's screaming, he's red in the face, you blew my cover. He's going to kill them all. Finally, my name is not Quaid, all this stuff. So they finally sedate him. And the woman tells him about, there's some kind of memory cap. We hit a memory cap. The guy's already been to Mars, so on and so forth. And McClure's like, you idiot. He's just playing out sort of the package we sold him. And the woman's like, I don't think that's possible. We haven't implanted it yet. So they all kind of flip out. And they realize that some ambiguous called the agency can also do what they do in terms of memory reprogramming people, and they're all freaked out. They're like, someone has erased his memory, and it's a great. I don't know. I like it. I like it because he's out, and so it's all via the lens of other people, and it gives it a sense that it's really happening. It's kind of cool. So they decide they're going to erase his memory of coming to Recall and dump him in a cab, which they do. So he wakes up in this contraption called the Johnny Cab, which is kind of goofy. It's driven by this kind of robotic-looking dude with kind of a humanistic face. Looks more like an animatronic puppet, frankly, and he's got a goofy voice. And the Johnny Cab leaves him off back right before he gets on his subway, and he's met by Harry, strangely enough. And before he can be too surprised that Harry's there, a bunch of goons come, and with Harry's direction, they grab him and take him off to some secluded spot. We hear Harry, you blabbed about Mars, Quaid, and you shouldn't have done that. I told you. So they're about to kill him. There's a great line that Harry says, Quaid's like, you got me mixed up with someone else. And Harry's like, you've got yourself mixed up with someone else, of course, which is true. And then out of nowhere, Quaid springs into action. And it's a very violent scene. He hits one guy, blood spurts right away from the guy's face. He breaks Harry's neck with an audible snap. He breaks another guy's back, and then he grabs a bad guy's gun, spins him around, shoots him through the back, through the heart, and then shoots the last guy. And there's this great shot. The camera pulls back at the end, and we see him standing there with the gun amidst all these bodies. It all happened so incredibly fast. The walls are smeared with blood. It's a great scene, like, again, and this is Arnold doing his thing. Like, it's all very purposeful, and the moves are great. Like, when he moves around to kind of get in the way of certain guys, grab weapons and stuff, like, it all feels very, very natural to him. And yet the look on his face is one of, like, a guy on an amusement park ride. So really cool and very bloody, which will set the stage for Verhoeven's style in this original film. Lots of blood. So he comes home, and Laurie's practicing tennis with another kind of sci-fi cool moment in the film. There's this hologram, and she's kind of practicing along with it. He shuts the lights, and he tells her the whole story. And of course, she's like, "You're living out what they implanted in your head, you fool," right? And so he holds up his hands, which are full of blood. So she ostensibly at that point says, "I'm calling a doctor," but a rough-looking dude kind of picks up the video phone, and it does not look like a doctor. It is, in fact, Michael Ironside, who plays Richter, who's one of the main antagonists in this film. We don't hear their conversation, so we see Doug, in the bathroom washing up, and all of a sudden the lights go out, and he's being shot at by whom he thinks is some third assailant that's come into the room, and of course there's a fight in the dark. And another wonderful twist, the lights go on, it's Laurie. And they fight. The fight's pretty good, actually, because obviously she's like, a third his weight. But how they have her fight, since he's so surprised that it's her, like, she works the surprise to her advantage, and some of her moves are pretty good. Like, it doesn't seem too bad, especially when she has the knife. She's hitting him in these strategic, vulnerable spots, groin multiple times, obviously. Finally, he disarms her, and then we get full disclosure that I don't know who you were in your past life, but I didn't know you. Up until 2 weeks ago, your mom was erased, and this identity was written on. She was written in as his wife. Everything was implanted by the agency. The job was set up by the agency, so on and so forth. So then he kind of lets her go, and they're both standing there. And he's like, "Who am I?" And she's like, "I don't know. I just work here." She sees Richter on the video phone behind him, so she distracts him, teasing him for another, go around physically before, he has to leave or whatever. Turns around and says the words "clever girl" and then knocks her out. So now we'll switch over to the remake for the similar sequence. This time, Quaid goes into recall, and it's all Asian design. Again, it's a weird anachronism because they're in Australia. You're given the location so you can get the whole through the earth thing, but they're in Australia, but they don't play up any aspects of Australian culture whatsoever. Like, it's almost like they're in Japan or China. There's a big Buddha head in the place. Everything's kind of an Asian knockoff. And he enters, and he's shown in by an admin to see Mac, who I guess is McClure. Like in the first film, lots of lens flares whenever he does anything. And Mac is played by an actor named John Cho, who is recently notable for playing Sulu in Abrams's rebooted Star Trek series. So we get a quick explanation about recall, which is very much a Matrix retread. What is reality really? It sounded actually more original in the original film than this film. I kind of piggybacking off the Matrix in a sense. And then he's piqued, of course, similarly by the secret agent program. Now we get a couple of little smart upgrades here. Mac tells him, no part of this memory that we're going to implant can be real. Otherwise, there'll be conflicts in your brain and it'll really mess you up. So they have to run a scan of his memory to see if the secret agent program they're going to run here is going to overlap with anything that's real in his life, his memories, which is cool. And they're pretty much there. And one notable thing they do is they stamp a peace sign on inside his elbow, which I guess will hide the needle mark because they're about to inject him with mostly chemicals, which is the original film. This was all done electronically. In this film, it's chemically derived. They're about to send him into his memory when Mac actually discovers that his true identity, that he's a secret agent, and we see all this kind of red flashing stuff. And when they're doing the memory scan, it's very high tech, very cool, very virtual memory. It's like 3D in the space, like a hologram, kind of neat. So Mac pulls a gun on him, but then the police enter out of nowhere, and they kill Mac and the attendants. So Quaid stands there by himself. They're telling him, you're under arrest, put your hands over your head. So he turns around, and then we get another shot through his upturned arms, which is very Matrix, as it were, very first scene in the first Matrix, Trinity. And then he goes into action. There's so many more people there. It's less believable that he, is not shot by any of them and actually takes them all down than in the first film, which is only 4 guys in close proximity who don't expect him to give them any trouble. However, it's shot in a very cool way. Reminded me again of The Matrix, where, The Matrix has these scenes in the film where the camera is on a camera for every degree set up in like a circle. And in a certain sequence, a computer will run the cameras, I think 1 per second or maybe a half second. So when you run it back on film, it looks like, you're virtually spinning around the person. And you recognize the sequences in The Matrix when Trinity jumps up, the camera spins around her. So this is similar. The camera seems to be on a pre-programmed track. It's kind of ping-ponging back and forth in and around the fight scene. The fight is choreographed, so the camera sort of flies over certain parts of the fight scene when it's happening. It's very cool, and I rewound it a couple of times. It's jarring in the sense that you really, it's not pretty, and you really sense that the camera is really on some kind of artificial motion. It doesn't feel fluid in any way, but it does give the scene a little something extra, which I kind of like. It still happens too fast, and it's a little too generic. I still prefer the original film, mostly because it's bloody. He's really getting his hands dirty in the fights, where this is a little more balletic and a little more movie-ish and seems a little less real, frankly. So then we get a very cool sci-fi moment where there are cops outside the room that he's in. He's disabled all the cops inside the room. The cops need to know what's going on, so they shoot this device through the door into the room, and it fragments into like 24 mini cameras, which then gives a full picture of the room to the guys outside. It's really neat, like really well thought out, very cool piece of technology. Then basically Quaid sets some grenades on a delayed fuse. He lures the outside men in, but he, of course, finds a back door. They come in, the grenades go off, and he drops down into the lower part of the city, which is all basically water and docks and boats and stuff. And it's always raining, like in The Matrix. He returns home. Laurie is on the phone. He enters, and, as fans, we recognize she's probably talking to her boss about him. Then we see on the news that there was 20 people shot at recall, and Doug tells her that this was me. And of course she's laughing. She's like the first film, she's like, you're just playing out an implant. This is BS. It didn't really happen. And as she's hugging him, he kind of gives into it a little bit. She tries to lay a sleeper hold on him. And at some point he can't breathe. And then they have a fight. And they fight pretty much to a draw. I guess the advantage here is his, again, like the first film, his consternation that he's even fighting someone whom he thinks he's been married to for 6 years. Then she grabs a gun and starts speaking in an English accent, and she had an American accent to start the film with, so kind of a clever little moment to cue us in that she is definitely not who she says she is. But he finally gets the drop on her. She finally tells him the same situation as in the first film. I didn't know you from 2 weeks ago, and so on and so forth. And they take pretty much from the first film where he says, well, then who am I? And she's like, I don't know. I just work here, which is a great line and a good pull from the first film. And he winds up incapacitating her for a moment and escapes, and she is in hot pursuit. Now, the big difference here is that there is no Richter character. The writers have merged Laurie with Richter into one. So we have, she is the main chase antagonist in the film, reporting directly to Cohagen, whereas in the original, there's Laurie, there's Richter, there's Cohagen. So, big difference. Well, let's move on. We'll cut back to the original film. We have Quaid on the run being chased by Richter. What's important here is that when Richter comes into Quaid's apartment after he's left, we realize that he and Laurie are in a relationship. And he's very concerned about Laurie. So even so that one of his minions comes over to see how she is, he kicks the guy aside. Laurie is his girl. And basically, Cohagen has been having her shack up with Quaid the whole time. So we have motivation for Richter wanting this guy dead. It's, pretty much sexual gamesmanship. He wants this guy dead, and it's a good reason, happens every day. There's a guy with Richter wearing these huge glasses, and we see that somehow that Richter's able to be tracked. Definitely outdated visuals in terms of them tracking him, but still very dramatically sound. That Quaid really cannot escape at the moment. He's being tracked in a way he doesn't even understand. We get the wonderful X-ray scanner scene now because Quaid is heading for the subway. He runs through the X-ray scanner, but he has a gun this time. And we see it on the scanner, the skeleton with the gun, which is highlighted in red. and he's closed in on from both sides. So he has to actually come right at the camera through the glass, and he smashes through the x-ray machine. Still a great scene, really cool scene. And it's not a bad chase. Richter's after him. There's a lot of low-angle shots up at their faces as they're running. And there's a brutal escalator scene, which Quaid is halfway up the very crowded escalator. The guys up at the top open fire on him, and they kill this innocent bystander standing right in front of him. But Quaid uses the guy as like a meat shield. He somehow grabs a gun. I guess he had it. But the guys are tearing into the guy that he's holding up in front of him, just ripping him open. And he's just all perforated with bullets. It's gross. And he gets shredded. And he kills those two guys. And then this guy's behind him. And he turns around and swivels the guy around. And their bullets start thudding into the dude. And he finally throws the guy at Richter and his buddy who are behind him. And it is a grisly, grisly scene. But it's Verhoeven, man. It is startling. Like, it definitely pops you out of the movie. And Verhoeven does this a lot. Like, the violence matters in this film. It's not completely gratuitous. It does pop you out into the film, I should say. And you're just like, oh, man, that's intense. But you're in, like, it's not slick and cool and bad guys are dropping without blood. Like, it's grisly. So Quaid heads for a moving subway. He leaps through a window, smashing into it. Richter and his guys are kind of firing at him. And then, of course, he gets away. The train roars off. But we know that he's being tracked. And then Quaid on the train stands up, and we see another ad on the TV of like a real Mars holiday. And of course, we realize that at this point, he's probably going to try to get to Mars at some point. So then we get a brief Richter Cohagen speech. He's like, what are you doing? I want him back with Laurie. I want his memory reimplanted, so on and so forth. Richter pulls a fast one on him. He turns the knob. It's like, sunspot, sir, because he just wants him dead. And then his buddy reacquires Quaid, and they're off in pursuit. Quaid gets a room at some random hotel, and then he gets a call from this mysterious dude. And I really love this scene. He sees the guy on the video phone, and then the guy tells him to walk to the window and look down, and he's standing there with this metal briefcase. And he tells him quickly that they're tracking you, you've got a bug in you, and you told me that, if you ever lost touch or dropped off the grid, to come find you. And he won't give any information. And Quaid's basically like, who are you? It's like, we were buddies back in the agency on Mars. So he comes out, takes the briefcase, and then a very odd scene. Some homeless woman walks by and picks it up, and he grabs it from her, and he has to actually rip it out of her hands. And then she's like, fuck you, you asshole. And it's another uncanny, weird scene because you're like, where did that come from? And why is this old woman cursing so virulently? It's really weird. And also, he was told to buy time by this agent to wet a towel and wrap it around his head because the bug is in his head. And we get a cutback scene to Richter and his buddy, and they lose the direct track on him. But they know he's kind of in a certain area, but they can't really track him at this point. As he's walking with the briefcase, Richter and his buddy kind of enter into the big square where they are, and they see him direct line of sight, and so the chase is back on. And he jumps in a Johnny cab again, and he can't tell the cab thingy where to go, so he rips the whole thing out and just hits the button. So there's a brief chase. He loses Richter and his buddy who are on foot, and he makes it out to an old cement plant, and gets out of the cab, but the cab is so damaged that it takes off on its own and smashes into a wall, exploding. So he takes the briefcase to part of this in-progress building. We get our first set of reveals. He opens the case and we see red Mars money. We see a lot of false IDs with his face on it. Some odd-looking device that he puts aside. Wristband, we don't know what it is. Although he tries it out and we see that it's a hologram generator, which is very cool in that it generates a hologram about maybe 15, 20 meters away from him that he can manipulate. Very cool tech. I mean, and still to this day, the way they do it. And then he takes out this the world's clunkiest laptop, as I like to call it. And we get this reveal that we don't hear the word Hauser, but it's him on the videos telling him basically, look, you're me. If I'm talking to you, then Richter's gotten to you and erased your memory. And so the reveal is that, he switched sides. Cohagen found out about it and erased your memory and kind of stuck you somewhere. Why he wouldn't just kill him, who knows? But, we get the information that he works for Mars Intelligence, and now he talks him through the bug removal, which is still a really creepy scene where he jams that thing into his nose and he hears a crunch and he pulls out this ball. And while he's pulling it out, the head switches to a sort of special effects Arnold head, and it's just gruesome looking, as is So many of Verhoeven's touches here. And so he's told basically, head to the Hilton on Mars, flash the Brubaker ID, the rest will be done for you. So he sticks a bug in the chocolate bar, smashes the laptop so that supposedly it can't be, dealt with, and he takes off. Richter and everyone arrive. They think he's still there. They wind up, shooting a lot of dead rats until Richter figures out that he put the bug in his head in one of the rats. And that he is gone. In the last sequence, another grisly moment, Richter shoots the rat with a bug in it. And then we cut to the laptop, which is repeating, get your ass to Mars, get your ass to Mars. So they know he's heading to Mars. And it's just a chunk of bloody rat just like leaks down onto the face of the laptop. Like it's just gross, man. Verhoeven is just a very violent director in this movie, He's throwing blood and viscera at the screen wherever he can. And yet, and I'm not a big gratuitous violence guy, but it works in this movie because, sci-fi, one of the dangers of sci-fi on screen, it can be too slick and too clean and too, Star Trek The Next Generation-y and how it looks, right? So I think the grittier and more pungent you make your sci-fi, you balance it out a little bit, without having this continual sheen of prettiness and, futuristic stuff. We'll leave the original film at this point. So now we'll pick up where the chase begins in the remake. Len Wiseman continues from the Die Hard movie in this movie with his fascination with parkour. We had a pretty cool parkour chase scene in the Die Hard movie, and this is definitely a continuation of that in the sense that what he allows Quaid to have and Colin Farrell to have in this movie is, some parkour game. But it's a kind of dull chase, frankly. There's not much to it. I mean, it's a longer chase than the original film. So the original film, it's not the greatest chase in the world, but the original film, you are getting the moment with the X-ray screen, which is very cool visually. You're getting the meat shield moment, which is just grisly, but, it's visually impactful. And then, you get the subway, and it's over, This is a lot of daring do in this chase, but nothing ever really pops. And what happens here is that in this chase sequence that Kate Beckinsale gets all the best moves. Like, she's always shot really well. All of her moves in terms of chasing after Quaid are cool looking. She's always shown in like the best light. It's like, I think in the original film, Quaid had some cool moves on him. Like he crashed through the X-ray scanner. He did the meat shield bit. Like he had, some parts of his training were coming back, and you could see that, and it was thwarting Richter, who was frustrated. But here, it's like she never looks like there's a hair out of place, and she's always like half a step behind him, and he can barely keep ahead of her. But he doesn't have any cool moves. He's just, he's doing parkour, and he's continuing to, outrun her, but she's the one who's got all the moves. Again, it's just, to me, it's like she's the star of the movie here, and or the center of the movie, I should say, and it feels weird. There's one moment where they give Quaid a brief fight with a synthetic cop because her backup as she's chasing him are all these robotic cops. Because he's worked at the place where he's worked, he knows how to take it out. And it's a logical move that he can do this to these cops. So that's his cool moment, that he's able to take this thing out. Then he gets into a similar situation where for the moment he's evading capture, we see the palm of his hand light up. It's basically a phone embedded inside the skin of his hand, which is very cool, very cool. And he puts the hand to his head, and it's a mysterious benefactor, just like the first film. But in this one, the guy tells him, find a piece of glass. So he finds some glass, and then he puts his hand to the glass, and the glass functions as a video screen. And so we get like a full-on video of this guy speaking with him. Again, very, very cool design. I thought it was a very cool moment in this film. And we find out that as the phone is activated, he has popped back up on the grid, which has allowed this guy to be able to contact him. That phone in his hand is actually allowing the bad guys to track him. So that's the bug in this film. It's not in his head, it's in his hand. So the guy on the phone is telling him, you have to find this key somewhere. He rings off, and then the last thing we see is a safety deposit box number, and it goes dead. And then he goes somewhere and gets a piece of glass and cuts this phone, pulls it out of his hand. Kind of a grisly scene in the kind of Blade Runner-ish netherworld of this colony, and definitely, production design remains consistent wherever he goes. And he gives the phone to some kid who's like, "Oh, dude, you gotta give me that phone." Of course, he hands it to the kid. Then we get a Cohagen and Laurie conversation, which harkens back to Cohagen and Richter of the first film. She reports in. Cohagen asks her to take him off screen, or we see her in conversation with him. We don't know exactly what's going on, but we get a sense that she's getting some news about who Quaid is and what to do. And yet earlier, briefly in this scene before she's taking him off screen, we've heard Cohagen say, "I want him alive. What are you doing?" So very similar thing in that once she hangs up, she tells the main guy who's working with her, "Shoot to kill." You never heard that conversation. However, big flaw in this is that there's no motive here. In the original film, Richter's motive for killing Quaid was purely base and primal and understood, like he was with Laurie and, some of his guys are ribbing about him about it. And he's like enraged, like, I'm going to kill this guy that Cohagen forced my girlfriend to sleep with. However, for her, why she wants him dead and not wants to do what her boss tells her to do doesn't make any sense. So immediately the film loses some depth because there's just no motivation that she wants him dead. It's what the original film was about, and so they kind of just continue it. But, we never find what her motivation for killing him is, except she's just so much a badass that she wants him dead. It doesn't make any sense. Now we see Quaid head to a bank and the safety deposit box, thumbprint activated, kind of a flashback to the original film. He goes into this beautifully shot bank. Again, every sequence, every place in this film is just the most beautiful, rich, luxurious place you've ever seen. Like every bloody sequence takes place, even in the dingier parts of the colony, it's still like a car commercial. My eye definitely begins to tire of that kind of slickness. And I'll have more to say about that as we go. So we see inside the safety deposit box, there's cash. If you look quickly, there are some American bills, I guess, with Obama on the bills themselves. I don't know, or Obama's on some of these British money, and it's really odd. And we see this odd metal collar he pulls out, which we don't know what that's about. So it's a much briefer scene in terms of, goodies in the secret box kind of thing. And then there is a video file of himself, as there was in the last film, that he's been surgically altered and he has new memories and to get to his apartment. And the video that we get here is from him, similar to the beginning of the film, like in this kind of medical bay. Explaining to himself, "I only have a few minutes, blah, blah, blah." And then he has to find a key of some kind. So now I'll cut back to the original film because we are now into the Mars sequence. And so in the original film, we've gotten past the same situation in terms of, the bag of goodies that he left for himself. So now we're headed to Mars and we see an exterior shot, a brief spaceship, Marscape, as it were. Not the best exterior effects. In this, Verhoeven very much concentrates on, the interiors in this world. We get a sense of the Mars domes that are there. So we're in this sort of customs intake area. We're focused, we don't see Arnold anywhere. We're focused on this large woman. We see on the wall screen up above some information about someone named Quato, who we've heard briefly before. This woman goes and she clears customs. How long are you staying? 2 weeks. Then some odd thing happens and, she keeps repeating her 2 weeks, 2 weeks. And then she goes into these odd spasms. She stutters, and Richter, who had just cleared customs himself, was walking away to go see Cohagen. He gets a sense that something is wrong, so he looks back. This woman freaks out, and then you see this is really cool effects. Even now, it's more striking and startling than anything else in the remake, where the ear is then pressed, and all of a sudden, the woman's ear pops out, the hair disappears, and so the ear is sort of like a switch of some kind, and then the head comes apart in a series of sort of expanding jaws, as it were, revealing behind it Arnold's head. The whole thing was sort of a fake contraption that morphed into, someone else's face. And it's such a cool scene because Verhoeven really frames it, and he holds while this happens. And, and the thing comes apart, and Arnold hoists it over his head. It's a great scene. Then Richter, he's like, that's Quaid. And he knows who he is. And he heads back into the customs area with sort of the police. The head, after it's been used, it turns into a bomb. So Quaid tosses it to the local cops. It explodes. I don't know whether it's that or the weapons fire from Richter and his folks, but the dome is cracked. And so all of a sudden there's this huge hole in the dome and people are getting sucked out. And so there's sort of this, everyone's holding on. Richter's holding on. Quaid is holding on. Someone's able to get to like the emergency switch, dropping the doors. Quaid is kind of able to roll under one of the last blast doors that comes down before it shuts, and he escapes and gets away from Richter, who kind of freaks out. So then we get a bit of the bad guys dialogue. Richter goes to see Cohagen, and Cohagen is furious with Richter. He's got some other plan in place, and Richter's confused by it, but he won't tell him what it is. We hear something about Quado wants what's inside Quaid's head, and we're not sure what that is yet. We think, we've heard Hauser tell him before in the video screen, you've got enough in his head to fuck Cohagen for good, but we have no idea what it is. And he threatens Richter with erasure if he doesn't get in line. So Richter's a little peed. Quaid arrives at the Hilton and he checks in. He's given a social security box, and inside is one slip of paper. It's a flyer for the Last Resort, which is a hotel in what they call Venusville, which is sort of the Las Vegas / New Orleans of Mars. Rather than waiting, Quaid basically just heads into Venusville. Before he leaves, he turns the flyer over and he sort of writes something on it and compares his handwriting to what's on the flyer, which says "Ask from Melina," and it's the exact same handwriting, which is kind of cool. So then we get this guy Benny with gold teeth, who is his cabbie and his driver. So Arnold gets in and they head to Venusville, and again, lots of luridness, but you do get to see these mutants. At one point, there's actually a brief firefight where the rebels are doing something and the cops are after them, so there's some violence that goes on. Benny's like, welcome to Mars, man. So they pass through, and then we get into Venusville proper. The whole mutant aspect of this is really cool, which is not dealt with at all. The remake did not do any kind of mutants stuff, which is why the three-breasted woman in the remake is kind of absurd. But they're all scarred, and I think what I like about it is they're not pretty mutants. They're not Vaseline lens mutants. They're ugly, man. I mean, some of these people look really gross and creepy. The women, the children, and the men, like none are spared. But they do have a really weird look about them. They do look really messed up, and yet some of them are very eerie. You get the sense that some of them have some sort of quasi-mental powers, a woman who reads palms, and other guys just have bizarre scarring over their face. But I think it's a really cool aspect. And the explanation that we get later is that Cohagen built these really cheap domes which let in a lot of cosmic radiation, which damages people at the cellular level, causing all kinds of mutation. Not enough ventilation to clear out what they call the bad rays. So it makes sense, like it's actually the mutants are not just mutants. There's a reason, and it's mostly because of Cohagen, which is kind of cool because it leads to a very powerful mutant who we will meet engineering the liberation of Mars. So again, it's a Rock'em Sock'em Hollywood movie, but underneath is some stuff, which is I kind of like. We get to the Last Resort, which is, a pretty cheesy 80s sci-fi kind of bar. You've seen them in some 80s sci-fi TV shows, but whatever. Here's where we get the girl with 3 breasts, and it makes sense. She's a mutant. And we see he asks for Melina, and we get a shot of Rachel Ticotin as she turns around. And again, it's the exact same woman who we saw when he was choosing women in his chair at Recall. So always, that fact here, and later on when we see the alien ruins and how they're exactly pictured back at Recall, leads one to believe that the filmmakers may have had more going on than they revealed in this film. But anyway, very cool, open for speculation, as it were. So one fun little factoid here, there's a mutant named Tony who's got a really creepy sort of flesh over one of his eyes. And it's played by Dean Norris, Breaking Bad's, Dean Norris. So it's kind of cool. So Melina calls him Hauser. And we get a couple of funny Arnold lines here. She's sort of talking to him like they're kind of, old lovers and, very saucy, as it were. So she grabs his crotch and she's like, "What have you been feeding this thing, Hauser?" And Arnold replies, "Blondes." Just great, one of Arnold's many great lines. And so ostensibly he's choosing Melina for sex, and so they're about to go up to one of the rooms. Dean Norris comes over, and again he's a really gross looking dude, and he goes, "You got a lot of nerve showing your face around here." And Arnold gets another good line, "Look who's talking." And then Tony gets angry and he goes, "Relax, you'll live longer." So he's got like 3 zingers inside of like a minute and a half. It's really great. So now we get a brief scene between Rachel and Doug. She slaps him. "You bastard, you're alive," blah, 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 blah. She's angry. She hugs him and kisses him. And he has to say, and he has to tell her the deal, that "I don't know you. I was written in as a sort of someone else's program, 2 weeks ago." And yet she kind of says, "You never loved me, Hauser. I always knew you were still working for Cohagen, that you were playing me." So in a sense, she loves him in spite of herself, but she also knows not to trust him. But this whole Quaid persona is a sort of a curveball for her. And yet she throws him out anyway, not trusting anything that he says. So I'm going to pause here because the next sequence is when we deal with the people from Recall coming to try to convince Quaid he's still there. And there's a very similar scene in the remake, and I want to kind of do them together. So let's pick up from the remake. Quaid's next deal is he has to go to his apartment and find what his earlier video self has told him is, quote, the key. Nobody knows what that is yet. Hauser's apartment was actually in the UFB, whereas Quaid, was set up to live in an apartment in the colony. So he has to go back through the fall and back through the UFB. So the cool thing is the first sequence, we see a woman who looks very much like the woman that Arnold was masquerading as in the original film, which I think is very clever by the filmmakers. It's kind of a fun thing. So now behind her is an older Asian man. And if you were paying attention when Quaid was opening his safety deposit box in the bank, one of the IDs he flipped through had this guy's look. So when I saw the guy, I was like, oh no, I think they're probably going to do is what exactly they do, and they do misdirection here. But the camera stays on the woman and she's almost dressed very similar to the original film too. So you're totally like, oh my God, her face is going to blow off again. And we get the 2 weeks line as well, which is kind of fun, But the Asian man, as he's going through the scanner, we see his face sort of morph. And basically the difference here in the remake is that the collar that Quaid had found in his safety deposit box, when it's worn by the user, projects a hologram. So they do take the hologram from the original film. They just don't use it in a military way like they did in that film. In this film, the hologram is the face mask. So unfortunately, it's not working properly. The cops see the face kind of shift from his face to the Asian man's face, someone else's face, and they know that, there's some kind of a spy going on here. So he busts through the checkpoint and he gets a gun off of one of the checkpoint guards. However, Laurie is not far behind. She follows, and as she's following him, she picks up the collar that he tossed aside. That will play into the film very much near the end, that she has this device. So now we get a car chase. Whoopee. If you've listened to podcasts of mine in the past, you'll know that I generally hate car chases, and this one's no exception. It's very much reminded me of the Minority Report car chase scene, except in this case, the cars aren't, magnetically stuck to the road directly. There is a hover. They are magnetically connected to the roadways, but there is like a hoverish distance between the car and the road. But Quaid is on foot at this point. And then all of a sudden, one car sort of stops and spins around, and it's Jessica Biel playing Melina. He gets in. How she knew he was there is anyone's guess. So they're driving, and Laurie is in hot pursuit. She's in one car. I think there's a second car with some synthetics. And after a few close calls, Melina asks Quaid, who is that? And he's like, it's my wife. And she's like, you're married? And it's okay. Not the funniest line. It's delivered kind of flatly in what is a very intense car chase scene. And the marriage jokes with the trying to pull from the original film don't really fly here. And I think mostly it's because Colin Farrell and Jessica Biel, are very earnest actors. They're very deadpan. And, there was a playfulness to Sharon Stone and Schwarzenegger where they could be kind of serious and yet they could kind of pivot, and maybe that was the director also understanding that tone and how it was written, but it was written much better in the original film than this film. All these jokes kind of fall flat as you're kind of hurtled through this, the slick world. So after some daring do, car chase is now continuing, but the road is above them, and I guess the cars now cling to the road. There are magnets in the roof. Laurie is about to converge on he and Melina's car when Quaid basically overrides the car's internal systems and shuts off the magnets, and the car drops straight down. And it's a cool moment because they cut all the sound, so you really just get this silent car falling down. It's a nice little moment. And of course, he turns on the mags at the last minute, breaks his fall. They are clear of hotly pursuing Laurie. They get to Hauser's apartment, and Melina is now with him, and he's searching for some kind of key. And this is a little kind of unbelievable. There's an earlier line when I think he's talking to Harry when he says, I'd love to be able to play the piano, Harry. It was something that he wished he could do. We see there's a huge grand piano in Hauser's apartment. And, again, it's a beautiful apartment, very slick. It could be like a furniture store ad. Like everything is just so beautiful and white and soft, and it's shot really nicely, and again, there's just so much of that in this film that after a while, as coherent and consistent as it is, I don't know, I just get kind of numbed out by it. It's weird. He finds a gun, I think, somewhere there, and we see that he also knows how to play the piano. And when he gets to, there's some Beethoven I think he's playing, he gets to one key and it's dead. He realizes that the key is removable, and then he has to put it back. And I don't know, there's some odd switch of one black key with another. And then he continues to play, and at one point in one of the pieces he's playing, the camera's inside the piano, and you see it all lights up, and everything freezes, and some hologram pops up. And it's actually Ethan Hawke, who is the original Hauser pre-surgery. And we get the second part of sort of, Hauser's message to himself. And very much same as the original, that it's really a nice scene. Ethan Hawke really lends a little bit of gravity to this thing. Nice little monologue he's got, but it's the same notion that Hauser realized he's working for the wrong people and switched sides. But the information we get is that Cohaagen is actually responsible for the bombings that have been going on in the UFB, that the force that's against, the sort of quasi-rebels are very peaceful. And none of the civilian bombings, or peaceful to the point where they've only targeted military targets, military installations. But Cohaagen has been bombing civilians. It's all 9/11 shadings, but, whatevs. And the idea is that the UFB, they're running out of space in, our first world, the United Federation of Britain, and they need breathing room. And so what they want to do is start this war so they can occupy the colony and sort of, push out all the people who live there. And it makes no sense because, these people actually do all the working for the UFB. You're just going to have all rich people living in all the space, who's going to do the work? Maybe the synthetics are targeted to be the workforce. Who knows? But anyway, so we get what Cohaagen's plot is, and we understand a little bit more around Matthias and the rebels and what they're about. Piano key's a bit much. How he gets to this hologram to react is so like a Rubik's Cube. Yeah, I thought it was just kind of a little much by the filmmakers. Melina wakes up. She tells him that his dreams are actually memories. And that the scar on his hand was actually, he didn't get it from working at the robotics plant, but a bullet was shot at he and Melina when they were trying to escape from that scene in the beginning of the film, and the bullet passed through both of their hands. She has a scar as well, which is a little factoid that, again, will come in later in the film to be used as a plot twist. I'll stop here and just kind of compare the two To Mars sequences. The first film, it's much more of a simpler setup in that Doug finds this box, he finds out this information, he gets what he needs, he goes to Mars, finds Melina, and it's a dead end at that point. And we get a little more we get the mutants, and, it's very easy to follow, and it all makes sense, and you're getting hit with new things from time to time. There's a really cool sequence of, Quaid in the customs when he comes in with the head, really neat. So a lot of cool things. In the remake, you're getting more slick movie making. The bug being in Arnold's head versus the phone being in Colin Farrell's hand. Head beats hand, sorry. There's this odd sense in the remake of Laurie being the focus of things and always cooler and better than Quaid. Whereas in the new film, they give Quaid some moments when he's escaping from Richter, and he puts the bug in the rat, and they do that as well in the remake where Quaid gives the hand phone to some kid. But again, even when she arrives, she has to dominate the scene, and it's not like we don't get a nice sense that Quaid has bested her. She's always seems to be if not expecting what Quaid is going to do, not surprised by it, and I don't know. She's too perfect as a bad guy. Like there's never a moment where, our hero does something where we're like, yeah, Whereas in the first film, Richter's pretty relentless, but Quaid gets the upper hand at times, and I don't know. It's satisfying. I feel like a film breathes that way. The remake is just oddly airless in its chase because I feel that the filmmaker is conflicted as to who the focus of the film is. It's not Quaid, it's Laurie. Whenever Laurie's on screen, Laurie's the focus of the film. Quaid is marginalized. Whether that was done consciously or unconsciously, I feel like it does exist. And again, the film continues to feel oddly unbalanced for all that. Okay, so now we're going to get the recall scenes. So we'll go back to the original film. First scene, Quaid is back, having been spurned by Melina. He's back at the hotel. There's a knock at the door. This kind of dweeb little guy called Dr. Edgemar claims he's from Recall. Quaid's got a gun out, and we're giving this startling information that, Quaid is still at Recall right now, and that Edgemar has been artificially implanted. Arnold's wonderful lines, bullshit. So he's got the gun on him, but Edgemar makes these great arguments, and this is a good one as part of the film. It's like, let's face it, Doug, is it more real that you're this, secret agent from Mars who's forgotten his identity and, one step ahead of all the authorities, or that, that you're the center of a conspiracy to make you seem like you're a lowly construction worker, right? And it's a good line. At that moment, he's a little miffed. There's a knock at the door again, and it's Laurie. And again, she's back into character. Honey, you're still there. Please come home. And so the whole notion is that if he continues, that he'll be lobotomized and, that he's free-forming this delusional recall trip, but he's controlling it and so on and so forth. So we get to this dramatic moment where he's kind of cornered, Quaid, and he's like, well, what do you want me to do? And he's like, swallow this pill. It's nothing, but it's a symbol in your mind. You'll fall asleep and, you'll wake up back at Recall where we can, fix all this damage. And if he doesn't take it, 1 minute he'll be the savior of Mars, and the other minute, Cohagen's bosom buddy, which, oddly is kind of what happens as the film goes. So it's very tricky. But the cool moment here is that at one point, Quaid says to Edgemar, so it wouldn't matter if I just blew your brains out right now. It wouldn't mean anything. And Edgemar's like, no, it wouldn't, but without me here to guide you out, you'd be lost forever. So there's this moment where, you're holding and he's about to take the pill, puts it in his mouth, and Edgemar's like, swallow it. And he's about to, but he sees that Edgemar is sweating. He puts the gun right to his head and blows his head off. Very bloody scene. And then Laurie changes out of character right away. Now you've done it. And the whole wall explodes, and there's a whole group of people behind him. They enter the room, and they subdue him. He is now down for the count. However, they don't get far because Melina shows up with a gun, rescues him, sort of mows down most of the guys guarding him, except Laurie. And then we have this fight between Laurie and Melina, which is pretty cool, actually. Pretty well choreographed, pretty believable. There's not like it's two women, so they pull hair and grunt at each other. They both know martial arts. They're both hitting and striking in ways that are seemingly damage-producing. It's a very cool fight. Laurie, at one point, gets the upper hand on Rachel. Arnold gets to, she's about to, do something to Rachel, and Arnold picks up a gun and points it at her, and she then goes back into character. Honey, you wouldn't shoot me. I'm your wife. And he puts one right between her eyes, and then we have this moment of him, consider that divorce. We get another one of his great lines, which is awesome. So now we've got a bit of pursuit. Richter is following them. He sees Laurie dead. And of course, this is the end of the line for him now. He's apoplectic with rage. And at one point, they're running along the catwalk, and Richter's about to shoot at them, but his buddy takes him down and says, you'll crack the dome, you'll kill us all. And Richter kind of flips out. Benny arrives. Consequently, they jump in his taxi. They're being chased by Richter. So there's a bit of a car chase which is not so great. And then they go into the last resort and they're hidden quickly. Melina has them hidden to a hidden door. They put a table in front of it. And then Richter comes in and realizes they've got him hidden, and in a kind of really hardcore way, they open up on the patrons and just start killing all the mutants in the last resort. And there's a full-on battle. Richter's henchman is killed by this little person. The guy who was tracking Quaid throughout most of the film is dead. And they call the cavalry. And so there's this whole group of people descend on Venusville, and they're going to kill everyone. But Cohagen contacts him and says, and finds out what's happened, and he's like, cease fire and pull out. And so basically, they everyone gets out and they seal off the sector. Quaid is now on his own in the Resistance, on his way to see Quado. One last bit is that Cohagen turns off the air to the sector, and we visibly, get these successive shots of these giant fans slowing down and then finally stopping. So, we've got a clock ticking now, however long these people have to survive, how much air they're going to have. So now back to the remake. Similar sequences happen here as well. Melina and Doug now need to get to Matthias because part of this hologram, they found out that he's got a key in his head, which is basically the Hauser tells him is the shut-off key for all of these synthetic police. With that key in Matthias's hands, it's in what that's called kind of a black box in his head. So he himself can't remember the information, but when Matthias gets a hold of him, he can dig it out. And this is very similar to, Quato digging out information out of Quaid's head in the original. So they both need to get to see the sort of respective heads of the rebellion. So in the remake, they go to the first level, and now we have a very similar sequence about they're trying to trick Quaid and to believing that he's still back at Recall. So they get to the first level, and outside around the building is surrounded by cops, like dozens upon dozens of cops. Harry enters by himself, and he sort of delivers the line that, dude, you're at Recall, your wife loves you. And at one point during this whole thing, Quaid looks outside, and there's Kate Beckinsale playing the aggrieved wife, crying. She never comes in to talk, but she stays out there. Lens flares up the wazoo. This goes on for a long time. Like, it doesn't go on. It's much longer than the original film. It's a lot more melodramatic. I think Harry slips up, and I forget what he says, but Harry slips, and Doug's like, Harry, you made a mistake here. And he's like, Doug, it's because you wanted me to make a mistake. The gambit here is that, everything that's coming out of Harry's mouth is being produced by Doug. You want me to be confusing, and you want this to be the way it is. And that's kind of his whole deal. And then, Harry's ultimatum, he's like, rather than take the pill, you have to kill Melina, and that will prove to yourself that she's not real. And when that happens, I can guide you out the rest of the way. So very melodramatic. At some point, they drag the tension out, and Melina swings the gun on him. He swings the gun on her. Then they don't trust Harry. The gun swings back and forth. Like, it's a little absurd. And then there's this intense thing where, Quaid's got the gun pointed at her, and it looks like he's going to pull the trigger because Harry's really very convincing, although it's very cockamamie. And Melina lowers her gun, and she cries. Like the original film, was the sweat. In this film, it's her tears prove to him that she's real, not Harry. So he swings the gun around and blows Harry away. So now we have this chase scene where Laurie now busts through and she's chasing them. In the lower bowels of the building is like an elevator system, but it's a horizontal and vertical system. So there's a lot of, made me think of Star Wars. So there's a lot of daring do in the elevators, and they're getting out of the way of the elevators and jumping in and moving out of the way and so on and so forth. And there's one synthetic cop chasing them besides Laurie. And there's some arms being sheared off of the synthetic, which kind of harken back to, we haven't gotten to it yet, but Richter's arms being sheared off the elevator in the original. So, I guess there's an echo of, there's an elevator scene in the original, there's an elevator scene in the new one. And Laurie is given the cool moves. She runs and slides into the elevator from a distance. And then there's a fight in very close quarters. So it's Quaid, Laurie, the synthetic cop, and Melina in the elevator. And basically it's Laurie versus Melina, and Doug versus the synthetic, and they're all fighting with each other, and it's all right. It's really jump cut-ish, so I'm not getting much clarity over what's doing what. There's a lot of tension, obviously, but this is the moment when the synthetic is cut in half. And near the end of this sequence, Once Lori realizes she's about to be double teamed, she sticks a bomb in the elevator and then she jumps away and lands like down further in another elevator, watching them. Of course, Doug and Melina jump out of the elevator just as the bomb goes off, but they are now safe and free and they sort of run away. So Lori has been thwarted, although yet again has every cool move in the book. Then we get the information that there's been an escalation by Cohagen. He's now mobilizing the synthetic cops. He's going to send a massive army through the fall from the UFB to take control of the colony. So I'll stop here because now we're going to get into sort of the end game of the films, and I kind of want to do them together, and we'll cut back to the original. Now we're into the last acts of these films, or just about the last acts. I'm going to jump back again to the original film. We've got Quaid and Melina now underground, walking, I'm not sure where, but they walk past some tombs of sort of the original settlers. We hear Rachel talk about Cohagen profiting from these, dead settlers, building cheap domes, watch their kids turn into freaks, and sell air back to them. So really kind of a cool setup in terms of this world is very fully realized. We get a complete ground up of the Martian world, how it operates, which is kind of cool actually. There's a brief kiss between them, before they kind of head into the action. No real chemistry. I mean, no one really has chemistry with Arnold in any film that I can remember. The rebels then come out of nowhere. They obviously, these are their hidden caves, and they're not sure about Benny. And then Benny unfolds. We see that he's got his fake hand, and he pulls it aside, and he unfolds his arm, which is kind of like a weird little chicken wing. Being a mutant, they assume that he's anti-Cohagen. They're taken to this secret base. The head dude, his name is an actor named Marshall Bell, who I remember from a particularly interesting X-Files episode where he plays a judge who hires a guy to go out and sort of kill people that have gotten off of the law. Pretty cool guy, pretty decent actor. Then this guy approaches him and he's basically, I'm going to take you to Quado. We're going to try to dig out what's in your head. And so they go into this room and they're talking back and forth. And he's like, where's Quado? And he's coming. And then the guy turns around and you see him. He's sort of groaning in pain. And he turns around and Quado emerges from his belly or his body. It's just so cool that Quado was part of him. This is a huge mutation. Quado is just really creepy looking. He's got these, his eye pupils are not round, they're sort of splotchy, and he's got this greasy hair. I mean, he's a gross dude, he really is, and he's got this kind of 2001 Hal kind of voice, but it's kind of penetrating in its own way. And so basically he grabs hands with Quaid. Now we get a sense of his psychic abilities. So we get this brief thing from Quado. They're talking about who Quaid is. Quaid's kind of realizing who he is, and Quado said a man is not defined by his past or his memory, but his actions, which, kind of the through line of the original film. That it's not, if he doesn't want to be Hauser anymore, he literally doesn't have to be, and Hauser doesn't have to define his future. So, kind of cool. So then we have this montage as we're looking in Quaid's memory. And we see this huge atmosphere generator, these massive rods suspended over what we're told is a glacier underground over most of the planet. And we're kind of, then we're flashing back and we kind of hear Cohagen and Richter who are walking, and this is a memory, I guess, of Hauser, that it's like 500,000 years old, but the turbinium, which is the substance that they mine on Mars, Cohagen's afraid that if they turn the thing on, the chain reaction will ignite the turbinium, basically exploding the planet. So we get, that info. And at the end of this montage, the camera zooms in on this round dais, and there's a 3-fingered impression in the center of it, which is basically what we're getting a sense of is the on switch, if you will. At this point, there's a rumbling, which we think is in the dream, but of course, Quaid snaps out of it. It's not the dream. These tunnelers, which we've seen in most of the film, these huge tunneling machines that have been rumbling around throughout the plot, are now crashing into the rebel stronghold, and Cohagen's, police forces enter, and they're killing everyone. They gun everybody down. Benny, Quaid, and Melina escape. They think they're going to get away. Benny then is revealed as a traitor. And he opens the door. Cohagen comes in, and basically the jig is up. But there's one last breath by Quado, who's lying there dying, and he tells Quaid, turn on the reactor. And then Benny blows his head off, and he dies. So now we're at Cohagen's office. Quado slash the guy who he came out of is on a table, dead, and the whole plot of the film is revealed. Basically, the idea that Hauser came up with to create a Quaid overlay personality to him to fool Quado and the psychics. Because what's Cohagen's saying is that they could never get someone in past Quado because he's a psychic, and there are other, I guess, mental psychics as part of the rebels that, any imposters would be instantly, revealed. And so could never get anyone in to find Quado. So in a sense, they had to create a foolproof personality that was revealed to any psychic as a genuine person. Hence the creation of Doug Quaid. Cohagen supplied him with the laptop at the beginning and all the gadgets to take the tracer out of his skull, the money. They set up that guy who brought him the case, Benny. Quaid doesn't believe it. Basically Cohagen saying, well, it almost didn't work because Richter went hog wild, blowing everything up and killing everybody. But I knew, being the agent that he knew Hauser was, he knew that no one really could stop him getting to Mars if he wanted to. But the kicker is Cohagen flips on a video recorder, and it's Hauser. He starts off by saying, if you're there, the Quado's dead, and you've led us to it. Great job, buddy. So basically, the whole thing's revealed as true. That video ends with Hauser saying, it's my body you have, and I want it back. He says, I hate to be an Indian giver, which is kind of funny. That was still floating around common parlance at the time. It's kind of interesting. So they drag Quaid and Melina into a room with these recall-like machines. They're basically going to erase Quaid's personality and then uncap Hauser's memories, which I guess are still there. And they're going to reprogram Melina with a new, what they tell her, docile personality. And Cohagen really becomes the villain when he says, you're going to be docile and compliant, just like a woman should. He will be dying soon with that one. Not a feminist. Then right before Cohagen and Richter leave, one of his minions sort of calls him and says, hey, the oxygen levels in the Venusville sector are running to 0. What should we do? And Cohagen's like, fuck them. Let them die. It'll be a lesson to the rest of them. And so now we've got a clock ticking, and, we get Quaid's protests about the air to Cohagen. Richter comes up to him. He asks the doctor, hey, doc, is he going to remember any of this? The doc's like, nope. Sucker punches him. And then he's like, see you at the party, buddy. And he leaves. And we'll get that line again real soon. Cohagen and Richter and the minions leave, and it's just them and the doctors. And Quaid goes berserk, rips off one of the metal gauntlets, and it has a sort of metal spike attached to it, and plunges it into the doc's neck. Lots of blood, as Verhoeven has been in this film. So he winds up taking out each of the people as he's sitting down, and he finally gets up, and he has this instrument in his hand. The last guy he kills is sort of standing next to the camera, so we don't see him, but he jams this instrument into the guy's body, takes his hands off it, and the instrument just stays there. So we know that he's killed someone. It's a cool little directorial touch, kind of like it. Then a brief cut to Cohagen and Richter. They find out that he's escaped. Richter's like, you got to make decisions, sir. And Cohagen's kill him. Fuck it. So at the end, Cohagen even betrayed Hauser. He doesn't want to spend all this time catching him again and trying to implant him. He realizes the Quaid overlay is too strong and there's nothing left to be done. And I guess he's pretty pissed about it. He kicks over his own fish tank, and we get a very close-up of fish dying, gasping for air. Obviously, the fate of the colonists if Quaid is not successful. Quaid and Melinda are now hell-bent on getting to the reactor, and they head towards it, and I guess Cohagen had a new wall built to hide it, and they're kind of screwed. And then somehow Benny is waiting for them in this exact location with a tunneler machine, which is completely outrageous, but whatevs. He heads for them, and he's grinding them into the rock. Quaid picks up a driller and drills into some of the hydraulic pipes, stopping it, and then he goes around the side. And, of course, we get another one, Schwarzenegger's lines, as he drills into the cab of the machine and impales Benny on the drill, screaming, screw you, Benny! Yet another awesome line. And so him and Melina finally, because the tunneler smashed through the wall, they now have access to the reactor. So he and Melina run. Then we see a big shot of the reactor, which looks exactly like the matte painting that Quaid was looking at when he was back at Recall. And one cool little side here is that, so the reactor is designed, in a sense, similarly to modern nuclear reactors, in that there are rods in the film. There are rods that are super hot, and they plunge into the glacier, which is super cold, and it melts the glacier, and it forms, oxygen, takes the oxygen out of the ice, out of the water. And the cool thing is, in modern nuclear reactors, there are control rods in a very similar way that absorb neutrons. So, briefly, modern nuclear reactors, uraniums are split in chain reactions, and it's the neutrons which are sort of the kickers that split the uranium atoms. So the rods, there are these control rods made of a substance that absorbs sort of neutrons. If the rods are plunged into the uranium reaction, they pull the neutrons out and the reaction sort of dies down. And then when the rods are pulled out, the reaction gets more robust, there's more neutrons, and the criticality of it increases. So the fact that they used this design element for the sort of oxygen reactor on Mars, I thought was great. To me, there's so many levels in this film. There are certain things about the science that are kind of cool if you really think about it, but otherwise, it's a slam bang action movie with goofy Arnie at the top of it. So kind of cool. So now we're going to switch back to the remake to kind of, ride along, as it were. So in the remake, of course, it's not Mars, and there's no abandoned tunnels. Outside of the colony is, the rest of the planet, basically, besides the the British Protectorate and most of the Australian landmass is, what they call the null zone, which is completely wasteland, decimated by chemical weapons. What's happening here is the rebels are hiding out in this null zone, and it's the first time we're in there. And they're on a train into the null zone, which I think is kind of cool. It was kind of a train sequence in the original, a little bit of an echo here. And of course, very similar, when they get out there, the rebels emerge from nowhere. The reveal here is that the Melina in this film is Matthias's daughter. So they get there and, they get to the lair, and Matthias calls for Hauser by himself. And we get the scene between Matthias and Hauser, and it's Bill Nighy playing Matthias. It's pretty great. And we get some dialogue echoing the original film. The past is not who we are. Talking to Hauser, trying to tell him that he doesn't have to be who he is. It's not a prison. The heart wants the present. That's the kind of what the screenwriters are getting at in this one. Then there's this chair that he's made to sit in, and there's this, I guess, kind of cool programming visuals that are going on as they're finding this black box in his head. But of course, what happens is they don't find a destruct code for the robots. It's all been a ruse. The black box is actually a beacon, which now leads Cohagen out to the null zone, right to the rebels. Cohagen's forces attack. Of course, Laurie emerges. They quickly overtake the rebels, basically. So we get this big reveal sequence. There was never a kill code, and Cohagen shoots and kills Matthias. And in the computer system in Matthias' lair, he retrieves the data to where all of the rebel forces are located in the colony, which he will now feed to his, robot police. And in this one, it's very similar. Cohagen congratulates Hauser. The target for him, what Cohagen says is, we couldn't get anywhere near Matthias, so we had you target Melina, and Melina could get us near Matthias. So the Hauser's target was to seduce Melina and infiltrate the rebels, and then lead them all to Matthias, whom they would kill. So now we get the notion that Cohagen's going to use the kind of recall technology to turn Melina into a denouncer of her father. They're going to reprogram her. Hauser will be returned to himself. And I'm always wondering here why we don't get the same Hauser video that we got in the original film. It would be a nice punch to see Ethan Hawke come back on the scene and say, "Buddy, you did it." And really, I think it would really sink in the sort of the betrayal here, but not to be. In a classic bad guy, like in the first film, Cohagen leaves with Laurie and giving orders for Hauser to be killed. This is kind of clever because the gentleman who Quaid spoke to on the video phone, right when he kind of escaped, Guy Hammond, was a guy who was with him in the agency who is actually, a mole for the rebels. So he's there as part of the group that's going to then, strap him down and kill him. When he leans in, he cuts Hauser's bonds and looks in his eyes, and we realize that it's that guy. Hauser then jumps up, takes them all down with this nice flourish, but he happens to also kill Hammond because he doesn't know which one Hammond is. They're all masked. And now we're getting into the final battle, and I'll switch back to the original. So now, back in the original film, we're in the last battle, and we're amidst these giant circular columns in the reactor. Richter and his troops are converging, and now we get the use of the cool wrist hologram generator. We get initially Arnold jumping into the midst of troops, as if he's sneaking up to them, but the troops see him and they all surround him and then open fire. And one nit I have here is that, they're all caught in each other's crossfire, and if this actually happened, they would have killed each other. They realize it's not him, and then he comes out of the sort of the shadows, gunning them down. It's really cool. It's really cool. I mean, it's surprisingly cool and satisfying. He and Melina come out and kind of gun a lot of them down. They do a little more of that. There's this one moment when he actually steps out and he's like, "Do you think this is the real Quaid?" And they think it's the hologram, but it's not. And he guns them down. Then Melina uses it. Eventually, they're all dead. Richter is trying to escape on an elevator. Quaid jumps. It's the Richter and Quaid final battle, and they beat the crap out of each other. Eventually, Richter is sort of hanging over the elevator, and he's going to take Quaid with him. As the elevator goes up, there's this, protrusion. It's above them, and, there's absolutely no room in between the edge of the elevator and this thing. And Quaid pulls Richter's arms back up, and of course, they're both sliced off, and Richter falls, and gross Quaid throws his arms and deals us another wonderful line. "See you at the party, Richter." And Richter is dead. So now it's our final showdown. Quaid and Melina find the reactor where that three-fingered sort of handprint is. But Cohagen is there waiting for them. We get the bad guy speech, of course, that he really believes the Turbinium is going to explode and that, he had it all and you guys had to come and screw it up. No, and he's like, "No, you had to be Quaid," whatever. There's a bomb that's attached because Cohagen wants to blow it up. Quaid gets to the bomb somehow, tosses it down an air shaft. It explodes, but decompresses. So some part of a dome that we don't see has cracked, and the air is now trying to suck them out of the chamber. They're all holding on, and we get, a nice end of the movie suspense scene. Quaid finally takes Cohagen and breaks his grip, and we see Cohagen die a gruesome Mars exposure death, which is very similar to the beginning of the film when Quaid was tossed out and the eyeballs start to come out and the tongue. This is way worse. Like the eyes almost go all the way out on stalks. It's really gross. And then we get the penultimate moment. Quaid sticks his hands in, turns on the reactor. And we hear all this movement, this massive movement of the reactor. But he and Melina let go and get tossed out onto the surface of Mars. And there's a long sequence. I mean, it's definitely absurd, but I mean, this film has flirted with absurdity in many ways. That within the space of like 90 seconds, that this reactor would create a breathable atmosphere all over Mars. But they do their best. There's a lot of fog and water vapor that's wafting down the mountains. But you see Melina and Quaid's face horribly distorted in this really ugly way that seldom does Hollywood make its stars, appear physically ugly in any way. And I always thought this was really cool that Melina and Arnold are like, they're half animatronic heads, half regular, and they just look gross until the atmosphere, takes over and we see the parting of the clouds and the sky is blue. And we see the shock wave of this atmosphere smash all the windows in Venusville, letting the air in. Lots of smashed windows. I mean, my God, it's like a minute full of window smashing. I couldn't help think when you see the blue sky in this film of, back at Recall, like when the guy said, "Oh, blue sky on Mars, that's a new one." And what if this is all a dream? So very cool. Thus ends the original. Now I'm going to flip back to the remake to finish off. So basically now, we have Hauser and Melina on their way to the fall to try to stop the massive amounts of robots that are coming. There are troops pouring into it. Lots of shots that reminded me of a sort of episode 1 effects-ish. Quaid takes this flyer, flies to, I guess, his apartment or a nearby apartment, gears up, and then he gets on the fall. So I guess Melina was taken prisoner. So it's not he and Melina that chase. It's just him. And we're on a fall ship, and it is on its way to the colony. And Quaid is now loose on the ship, and he's looking for Melina and setting a bunch of charges. Setting us up for the big finale. He finds Melina and he shoots 3 of the guards with that cool magnetic gun that we saw only in the beginning. I don't know why he waits till now, but maybe because they're human and not robots, he doesn't want to kill them. Still, it's a pretty cool scene. Then they kiss, they have their moment, and, we go forward. So now we're in the middle of the fall where the gravity shifts. Laurie is tasked by Cohagen to find them. And of course, she does very quickly, and they're in the middle of kind of being taken when the gravity shift happens, and all the weapons float up, and one flows right into Quaid's hands, and he kills the police. And one cool thing here is in null gravity, when he shoots the weapon, it actually propels him backwards, which I think is clever. Not too many filmmakers will pay attention to physics at this point in this type of a movie, but it's kind of cool. And then they use it as sort of a device when he grabs Melina and shoots the gun down and they float up. Very cool. And then somehow they find themselves locked into a compartment surrounded by synthetic cops. The only way out is to smash the window. So Quaid is basically outside of the ship, climbing up a ladder. Laurie is stopped from going after him by Cohagen, but she doesn't listen and tasks two synth cops to follow. They both are shot by Cohagen and the troops and captured when they finally get to the top of the fall. Now the fall has emerged in the colony. It is, it's captured, and standing atop it now is, this moment between Cohagen and Quaid. And so he's about to kill Quaid, and Melina arrives in another aircraft, and she opens up, decimating all the cops. And there's this black synthetic cop who's kind of like a special forces cop. Quaid disarms, with his knowledge that he gained working in the factory. Then we have Quaid and Cohagen fighting, which is weird, because Bryan Cranston, holding his own against the young buck like Colin Farrell. I don't know, it's kind of weird, he looks way stronger than he should be. As they're fighting, then the explosives that Hauser planted detonate, and we see the fall transport ship completely disabled, really bad shape. And then the last scene between Quaid and Cohagen, Quaid kills him with Cohagen's own knife. Melina and Quaid then jump to safety as this huge fall ship crumbles, the big finale as this thing is destroyed. And for the moment, the fall is blocked and the colony is safe. And her fate is indeterminate. So then Hauser wakes up and he's in the back of an ambulance, and we see Melina next to him. Supposedly we're relaxing in the end of the film. Quaid realizes that she has no scar on her hand, and we realize that it's Laurie with the hologram generator, the facial hologram generator that she picked up when Quaid dropped it way back earlier. The two of them fight, and again, the director gives Laurie all the cool moves. The big move in this is that, Laurie actually runs up the wall and across the ceiling and down the other side of the wall to get out of a hold that Quaid has put on her. And it's the coolest move in the fight, and I feel like that's the hero's move, and he gives it to the bad guy, whoever. And the way Quaid wins is he shuts off the lights, and I think he, she shocks her, and he takes a gun and he shoots her. She's actually dead, we think. Then he's standing outside, and the real Melina comes up to see him, and they embrace. And then he looks down at his arm, and we remember that in Recall, they stamped his elbow with this peace tattoo to hide the needle mark. And when he looks down at his arm at the end of the film, it is not there. And that is our moment of, we fade out really quickly there. We think, is that all real? Is it a dream? Very similar to the first film. Really, both films do end on ambiguous notes that are strong enough, should they had wanted to go forward with sequels, that I don't think they'd have much of a problem, picking up back at Recall if that was what they wanted. The two films. I'm going to start with Arnold versus Colin Farrell. I may have said this elsewhere, but I feel like a huge difference in these films is that Arnold is the center of gravity, Total Recall. For all those goofy accent, he is the physical gravity and center of the film. He's huge presence, right? He's a very imposing, muscular guy. And he moves really well, and his action sequences, his body choreographed really well. And he's impressive to watch. He's definitely an action hero, of the first order. Although, he is under the gun and on the run for a lot of the film. Being a secret agent, as he is, he has some cool moves and some cool moments where he really, he uses these things to escape. And we get a sense by the end of the film that he's quite capable and quite clever and canny as his memory's coming back, his physical memory's coming back anyway. And it's cool to watch. Colin Farrell, on the other hand, he's a terrific actor, but he looks like a lost puppy dog in this film to me. He doesn't have the physical presence of a real action hero. He's a great actor. I mean, I like Colin Farrell, and I think he's a really decent actor, but there's actors who can hold down action movies and movie stars, and there are good actors who can, play good roles. And there's a reason why there's maybe usually maybe 4 or 5 bankable, bona fide blockbuster actors in the world. It's an extremely rare and difficult thing because you're not really in control of it to a certain degree. Some star quality is something so bizarre and ephemeral. Farrell can outact Arnold on his worst day, but Arnold as a movie star, forget it. Like he has the presence that Farrell lacks. So to me, it's a big deal because there's no real center to me for the remake. It has no physical heroic center. To talk a little bit about the remake, part of that is the continual decision of Len Wiseman to, put his wife in the center of everything and make her the focus and she has all the cool moves. She never really misses a beat. And in the original film, the original Laurie gets killed, the original Richter gets stymied, and he gets his arms ripped off. In this film, Laurie is shot at the end after doing one of the coolest action movie moves I've seen in a long time. She's simply shot. There's no real satisfaction in her death at the end. It's Quaid basically barely escaping the wrath of this impossible demonic force, if you will. Also, there's no motivation for her to be going against Cohagen's orders trying to kill him. That's a huge flaw in this film. Why she wants to kill this guy. She's so cold and cool and calculating in every aspect of her character. She would do exactly as Cohagen asked, and why would she lose her cool with this particular guy? And, they weren't lovers really. She was faking it the whole time, and her character let us know it, so it doesn't ring true. So there's something to me that fizzles because she's not a real character. She's an antagonist. And to give her that much focus unbalances the film for me. Then there's the directorial style. So Verhoeven, has a wonderful Stark style. Things are very realistic, from Arnold jackhammering as his job to the real tactile feel of Earth, the mutants. It's a very stark, very direct, and intense visual style. Verhoeven is happy to let you into the screen without much fanfare because he's pretty confident in what he's putting on the scene and on the screen. You're going to be pretty happy with what you're looking at. And the remake, to me, is so slick. Everything is lens flares, and every scene looks like a bloody car commercial. There's no denying how slick and cool it looks, but there is a sheen to this whole film that to me drowns out everything that's underneath it. And, there's definitely some great production design in this film, but everything is slick. And, so many of the locations are these perfect apartments, these perfect business locations where I feel like in the original film, things were a little rough and tumble at times. And not everything was slick and perfect because Mars itself was kind of a rough and tumble place. But, even when you're in the colony, and I feel like the colony would have been better served by, a different type of cinematography than the sort of the British area and give us that rough visual, because we're looking at the colony, even though it's all like shanty towns, but it's still got that sheen to it, and even Venusville in the colony, it's like Blade Runner. It's beautiful. It's porcelain in a way. And so that slickness really, after a while, I got so tired of it. I got tired of the lens flares and the slick shooting that it really took me out of the film. So I much prefer Verhoeven's. In terms of the actresses, we have the two Lauries. You have Sharon Stone. You have Kate Beckinsale. I think I prefer Sharon Stone because Stone could do tongue-in-cheek and, kill her. Kate Beckinsale, as is her motif for all of her action movies, she's a one-noter. They gave her a lot of slick lines about I'm your wife and I give good wife and all that. They were throwaway lines. She was a one-note killing machine, as she was in, all of the Underworld films. To me, she's a very uninteresting actress when it comes to these types of movies. I think she has chops in regular films. I think she's fine. But in these action movies, she goes kind of dead-eyed, and she's boring to me. Melina, Rachel Ticotin, Jessica Biel. I really like Rachel Ticotin. There's something alive about her and something very present about her acting. And I do like Jessica Biel. I think Jessica Biel is like very... She gives it her all. I think she has that ability to put herself into the roles, and I always feel like she's a believable presence. But she wasn't given much in this film. Not that that's her fault, really. And her earnest style with kind of a nothing character here. In the original film, I got a sense that Melina was her own person. and that she could give or take Hauser for a while. But in this, like, I feel like Beale's in love with Hauser, like, from the minute we see them together. There's never a doubt. She's always kind of in love, and it kind of makes her a lesser character, and that she's kind of slave to this guy. Whereas in the original film, Melina's like, "You're full of shit, Hauser. You never loved me. You just used me." And in this film, when Melina finds out that that's the case, she's aghast, and she doesn't believe it, of course, and she cries at that other scene. So I don't know, kind of a nothing character. In terms of the production design, again, Verhoeven's, there are differences. On Earth, it's very stone and steel, kind of, Century City nihilism, as it were. It's definitely dated. Verhoeven's production design is definitely 80s and dated for sure. But it varies at least. Earth doesn't look like Mars. Whereas in the remake, whether they're in the colony or in Britain, I can't tell the difference really, unless you give me a wide vista to show me that we're not in a perfect place. Like when you're in and out of certain sequences and streets, I really can't tell the difference, And again, I think it's the sheen that this film was done in. At the end of the day, I think that the Total Recall, the remake, will fade very quickly if it hasn't already. And Arnold's and Verhoeven's film I think already has stood the test of time. It's getting dated. Sharon Stone's poofy hair. There are definitely some 80isms in this film that aren't dating particularly well. I don't know how much life Total Recall has left in it as of kind of a viable nostalgia film even, but it's still solid and it still works, and I think you could still watch it in 2015 and be entertained and even be piqued by some of the ideas. I think the scientific ideas in the remake just kind of vanish. It's just it's a pure setup, and there's robots, and then, it's basically an action movie. And it feels more like an action movie. Verhoeven's movie, for all its action, because of the alien technology and all that stuff, like, it's a sci-fi movie, man. Like, it's a sci-fi action movie. Whereas Wiseman's really just feels like kind of a quasi-futuristic action movie. It just feels more conventional to me as a film. So that is the end of this original versus remake Total Recall episode. I really had fun making this, and I want to thank everybody for listening. You can find us at scifionscreen.com or on Facebook. You can look us up on any smartphone podcast app, and you can subscribe and get new eps when they upload weekly. And thanks once again for listening, and I'll see you next time.